2 days before Christmas, 1974, a car sat alone in a parking lot outside a shopping mall in Fort Worth, Texas. The mall was called Seminary South. Hours earlier, it had been full, a Monday afternoon crowded with people finishing their Christmas lists before the stores closed for the holiday. By evening, the lot had mostly emptied. One car remained, parked near the Sears entrance, on the upper level. The doors were locked. Inside, on the back seat, sat a single wrapped gift, meant for a 2-year-old boy who was expecting his family home that evening. The boy's stepmother never came home, neither did the 2 girls who had gone shopping with her. Her name was Rachel, she was 17. The girl beside her in the family photographs was Renee, 14, and the smallest of the 3, at 9 years old, was a girl named Julie, who almost didn't go shopping that day at all. By 6 o'clock, all 3 were gone. Their families searched the mall that night, store by store, asking clerks to page the girls over the intercom. They found no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass, just a locked car, the one gift still sitting where it had been left, and 3 girls who had simply stopped being anywhere. One father climbed to a nearby rooftop with a neighbor and a shotgun, and watched the car until morning, in case anyone came back for it. No one did. The police were called that night. And the following day, something else arrived. A letter, addressed to the husband of the oldest girl, signed with her name. It said she was safe. It said she had gone away, and that she would be back within the week. It even described where the car had been left. Her mother didn't believe it. Her husband didn't believe it. Handwriting analysts, including examiners with the FBI, have studied that letter more than once in the decades since. Each time, the results have been described as inconclusive. At least one other examination, conducted separately, is reported to have reached a firmer conclusion, one that has never been reconciled with the others, and that this film will return to later. For more than 50 years, investigators have never been able to say with certainty who wrote it. 3 girls left home to finish their Christmas shopping. None of them ever came back. And the only written message anyone ever received afterward, a letter presented as coming from Rachel, though never proven to be hers, still has no agreed explanation. 5 decades later, what happened in the hours between an ordinary shopping trip and that locked, empty car is the story this film is built to examine, carefully, and without assuming an answer the evidence has never provided. To understand what was lost, it helps to first understand what was ordinary. In December of 1974, Fort Worth, Texas was a city of roughly 400,000 people, caught in a shift familiar to much of the country at the time. Its downtown was quietly emptying out, storefronts going dark one by one, while a newer kind of gathering place, the shopping mall, pulled families out toward the suburbs instead. Seminary South had opened 12 years earlier, in 1962, the city's first shopping center of its kind, an open-air complex built on what had once been a small man-made lake, its walkways lined with oak and magnolia trees, its courtyards built around a scattering of fountains. By the mid-1970s, it was simply where people went, for school clothes, for birthday presents, for the crowded, last-minute rush before Christmas. At that time of year, the walkways were strung with lights, and the record department played through a rotation of holiday songs that would have been hard to avoid, whether a person was there to shop with a purpose or simply to be somewhere warm and lit and full of other people. 2 days before Christmas. There were no cell phones in 1974, no security cameras watching the parking lots, no national alert system built for a missing child. That kind of infrastructure was still decades away. If someone didn't come home on time, the search began the way it always had, with the people who loved them, on foot, on a landline telephone, one store and one neighbor at a time. The 3 girls at the center of this story didn't know each other by accident. They were connected, the way people in a close neighborhood often are, through family, through dating, through simple proximity. Mary Rachel Trlica went by her middle name. She was 17 years old, a student at Southwest High School, and, for the past 6 months, a married woman. She had married a young man named Tommy Trlica that summer, and had taken on a role few of her classmates had, stepmother to Tommy's young son from an earlier relationship of his. She was, in most of the ordinary ways, still a teenage girl. Homework, friends, a driver's license, a 1972 Oldsmobile she liked to drive, while also learning, at 17, to help run a household. Lisa Renee Wilson went by Renee. She was 14 years old, a ninth grader, and close friends with Rachel. For several months, she had been dating a boy from her neighborhood named Terry Moseley. On the morning of December 23rd, he gave her a promise ring. By his own account, given decades later, it was one of the last things he ever gave her. And then there was Julie. Julie Ann Moseley was 9 years old, Terry's younger sister. The Moseley and Wilson families lived close to one another, close enough that Renee's grandparents' house and the Moseley home were practically on the same stretch of street. And Julie had grown up around Renee the way a younger sibling grows up around an older sibling's friends, present at the edges of a world that wasn't quite hers yet, but that she was always trying to join. Julie was not, however, originally supposed to go shopping that day at all. The plan, as Renee and Rachel understood it, had been for Terry to come along with them. But that morning, he chose instead to sit with a friend who was going into the hospital for surgery. Renee was frustrated with him for it. A small, forgettable disappointment, the kind almost any 14-year-old has with a boyfriend and forgets within the week. Julie didn't want to be left behind at home. She asked to come along with the older girls. Her mother, Renee Ann Moseley, later described that particular morning as a difficult one. She and Julie's father were separated at the time. She had recently started a new job, and money was tight. Her first answer to her daughter was no. Julie kept asking. Eventually, her mother gave in, on the condition that Julie be home by 6 o'clock that evening. None of the three girls left behind any documented reason to want to disappear. Renee had a Christmas party to get ready for that night, one she'd been looking forward to. Julie was expected home by 6. Rachel had a husband, a young stepson, and a house to return to. Their plan for the day was simple enough to fit on an index card. Renee had a pair of jeans waiting on layaway at a local Army-Navy surplus store, put aside weeks earlier and nearly paid off. After that, the three of them intended to finish their Christmas shopping at Seminary South, the mall that had anchored this part of Fort Worth for over a decade, and that all three of them had likely walked through dozens of times before without a second thought. Family members have since said the drive from their neighborhood to the mall took less than 10 minutes, close enough that none of what followed can be explained by distance, or by any part of the day being unfamiliar to them. Accounts differ on exactly when they left the house that morning. Some place it close to 10:45, others recall it as closer to noon. Neither account is documented with certainty, and this film won't pretend otherwise. What isn't disputed is the simple fact of it. Sometime before midday, on December 23, 1974, Rachel Trlica backed her Oldsmobile out of the driveway, with Renee Wilson and Julie Ann Moseley in the car beside her. It was, in every visible way, an unremarkable errand, on an unremarkable stretch of an unremarkable Monday. 3 girls, running out before the holiday, expected home by evening, one for a party, one for a curfew, one simply because that was where she lived. They did not come home that evening, and what happened to them between that ordinary morning and the locked, empty car found hours later has never been fully explained. Reconstructing the rest of December 23, 1974, means working with pieces of very different weight, a few confirmed stops, a couple of disputed sightings, and long stretches of the afternoon no reliable account covers at all. Some of what follows is documented fact, some is family recollection, offered years later, some is a reported sighting, never independently confirmed, and some is simply inference, a reasonable guess built from what was found. This case has often been retold as though those 4 things carry equal weight. They don't. The first stop of the day is one of the few parts of it investigators have never had much reason to doubt. At the Army-Navy surplus store, Renee picked up 2 pairs of jeans she had put on layaway weeks earlier. One older pair, one new. Both were later found in the trunk of Rachel's car, which is largely why this particular stop is treated as confirmed rather than simply recalled. From there, the 3 girls drove on to Seminary South and parked Rachel's Oldsmobile on the mall's upper level, near the Sears entrance, the same space where the car would be found again that evening. What happened over the next several hours is considerably harder to pin down. The mall itself was crowded that afternoon, filled with the particular kind of urgency that settles in 2 days before Christmas. Buxakri. The place was packed with people. Julie's brother, Terry Moseley, has said of that day, hundreds of shoppers moved through Seminary South in those hours, which should have meant hundreds of potential witnesses. In practice, it produced very few reliable ones. One account reached investigators in early January of 1975, roughly a week and a half after the girls disappeared. A young man who said he knew Rachel casually told police he had seen and briefly spoken with the 3 girls inside the mall's record department that afternoon, and that another person, never identified, appeared to be with them. Reported after the fact and never corroborated by a second witness, that account has remained exactly what it was when it first surfaced, a claim, not a confirmed sighting. The identity of the additional person, if one existed, was never established. A second account came second-hand, through a store clerk near a grocery store inside the shopping center. The clerk said a woman had approached her, claiming to have seen the 3 girls being forced into a pickup truck in the parking lot. Neither the woman who made that claim nor the truck she described was ever located by investigators, despite considerable effort. More than 50 years later, it remains a second-hand account of a second-hand account, impossible to confirm and impossible to fully rule out. Beyond these 2 disputed claims, the record contains no confirmed account of what the girls did or who they were with for most of that afternoon. This is worth sitting with for a moment. A mall full of holiday shoppers produced 2 accounts, both second-hand, both reported after the fact, and neither one independently corroborated. The absence of a clean, confirmed narrative is not itself evidence of anything in particular, but it is one of the central, frustrating features of this case, and it has shaped every investigation that followed. What is documented is that, at some point, the girls appear to have made their way back to the car. A single wrapped gift was later found on the back seat. The jeans associated with the Army-Navy stop were later accounted for with the car as well. Investigators have treated the gift as evidence that the girls returned to the vehicle at least once that day, though no witness has ever come forward describing having seen them do it. It is possible, but not proven, that this was their last stop before whatever happened next. The girls had given their families a rough shape for the rest of the day. Renee had told Terry she meant to be back early enough that afternoon to see him before a Christmas party that evening. Accounts differ on the exact hour she promised. Some place it in the early afternoon, others tie it more loosely to getting ready for the party later on. Julie, for her part, had a simpler deadline. She was expected home by 6 o'clock. For a while their absence wasn't unusual. On the last big shopping day before Christmas, in a mall full of people and traffic, running late was ordinary. Family members have said they assumed, at first, that the girls had simply lost track of time or stopped somewhere else along the way. By late afternoon, that assumption was harder to hold on to. Renee's promised return time came and went. Terry, waiting for her, has said he grew frustrated before he grew worried, the ordinary irritation of being stood up before it curdled into something else. Then, as evening settled in, Julie's 6 o'clock curfew came and went as well. By early evening, both families had grown worried enough to act. What they tried first, phone calls, checks with neighbors, other ordinary steps, isn't fully documented. What is documented is that, before the night was over, they drove to Seminary South themselves, retracing what they understood of the girls' plan, and checking the stores they were most likely to have visited. They found Rachel's Oldsmobile where it had been left that morning, in the upper lot, near Sears, parked and locked, with no sign that anyone had forced their way in. There was no broken glass, no damage, nothing to suggest the car itself had been disturbed. It looked, in every visible respect, exactly as Rachel would have left it, except that Rachel was not there. Renee's father, Richard Wilson, was among those who searched the mall that night. Afterward, he and a neighbor climbed to the roof of a nearby building and kept watch over the car until morning, in case whoever had left it there came back for it. No one did. The Fort Worth Police Department was contacted that night. What is documented is that the case was routed to the department's Youth Division within its Missing Persons Bureau, the unit that, at the time, typically handled young people believed to have left home on their own. From the earliest hours, investigators appear to have approached the disappearance as a likely runaway situation, rather than one involving possible harm. No public record explains, in detail, what led them to that conclusion so quickly. 3 girls, a 17-year-old with a household to return to, a 14-year-old with a promise ring given that same morning, and a 9-year-old expected home for the evening, had vanished from a crowded shopping mall in the middle of a Christmas week afternoon, leaving behind a locked, empty car. Why, when 3 girls had vanished and their car had been found without them, did the earliest response lean toward the possibility that they had left voluntarily? Whatever shape the early, voluntary departure theory had taken by then, the next development would complicate it rather than resolve it. The Fort Worth Police Department had barely opened a file on the case when the next development arrived. Not through a witness, not through a search, but through the mail. The following day, December 24th, a letter arrived at the home Rachel shared with her husband, Tommy Trlica. It was addressed, on the envelope, to Thomas A. Trlica. According to her family, that was not how Rachel referred to her husband. She called him Tommy. Inside was a short, handwritten note, signed with her name. It said she and the other 2 girls had gone to Houston. It said not to worry, that she would be back within about a week. And it named, specifically, where the car had been left, the same upper lot near Sears where it had already been found the night before. Some who have studied the letter closely have found that detail notable. It isn't possible, from the public record available, to confirm what information had or hadn't already begun to circulate by the time the letter was written, so this film raises the question without answering it. Rachel's mother didn't believe the letter was hers, neither did her husband. Their doubts reportedly started with something small, the formality of the name on the envelope. Rachel's mother, Frances Langston, who, as of the most recent reporting available, is still living, has for decades been quoted giving some version of the same statement, that a lot of people might think the girls left with someone they knew, but that she herself would always believe, until her own last day, that the girls had been taken. It is one of the few positions in this case that has remained consistent across nearly 50 years of interviews. And once family members close to Rachel looked closer at the letter itself, the small details didn't stop. The envelope's address was written in pencil. The letter itself was written in ink, on a sheet of paper too wide for the envelope it had been folded into, as though the two had not originally been paired together. In the upper corner of the envelope, Rachel appeared to have been corrected mid-word, what looks like a lowercase h-r traced over into an al, and the postmark carried no city at all, only a smudged, partial zip code, the last digit unclear enough that it has been read 2 different ways for 50 years, as a 3 or as an 8. If it was a 3, the letter would trace to Eliasville, Texas. If it was an 8, to Weatherford, a separate North Texas town, neither one connected, in any documented way, to where Rachel was known to have been going that week. None of these details, on their own, proves much of anything. An address written formally, a folded sheet of paper, a smudged postmark, each is the kind of small inconsistency that could have an innocent explanation. Together, though, they were enough to convince the family members closest to Rachel that something about the letter didn't add up. None of them ever changed that position. In the decades since, handwriting examiners have studied that letter on multiple occasions across several decades, including analysts with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Each time, according to statements from investigators over the years, the results came back inconclusive, not a match, not a rejection, simply unresolved. By 1978, the department itself would publicly acknowledge how little progress the case had made. At least one other examination has reportedly reached a different, more definite conclusion. According to a case page maintained in connection with the Fort Worth Police Department's own missing persons files, a forensic document examiner named Wendy Carlson reviewed the letter and has stated she would testify that both the envelope and the letter were written not by Rachel, but by her husband, Tommy Trlica. That conclusion has not been corroborated by the FBI's own repeated, inconclusive findings, and it could not be independently confirmed through a second source for this film. It is presented here for exactly what it is: one examiner's reported opinion, tied to a single case-connected source, sitting in direct tension with decades of official uncertainty, not a settled fact, and not an accusation. It is worth being precise about what a finding like that would and would not mean, even if it were someday proven, beyond any doubt, that Tommy Trlica wrote that letter. Authorship alone would not explain what happened to Rachel, Renee, and Julie. A person can write a letter under any number of circumstances, including circumstances that have nothing to do with causing anyone harm. Who held the pen is a separate question from who is responsible for 3 girls never coming home. This film treats those as 2 different questions, because they are, and it will not collapse them into one simply because they happen to involve the same object. Modern testing has changed how documents like this one can sometimes be examined, for handwriting, and in some cases for genetic material left behind on paper, ink, or an envelope's seal. Whether that kind of comprehensive testing has ever been applied to this particular letter is not clear from the public record. As recently as late 2024, the girls' families were still asking Fort Worth police to have it tested using current forensic methods, which suggests, at minimum, that the question had not yet been settled by then, 50 years after the letter first arrived. What makes the letter so difficult to set aside is that neither explanation for it resolves cleanly. If Rachel wrote it, she has spent 50 years without contacting a single person who loved her, including a mother who never stopped looking. If someone else wrote it, that person knew enough about her relationships and the location of her car to construct a letter specific enough to seem plausible, and yet still not convincing enough to satisfy the people who knew her best. It is this unresolved middle ground, not quite proof of anything, not quite dismissible either, that has kept the letter at the center of the case for half a century. Every subsequent investigator who has picked the file back up has had to start, in some sense, exactly where the first ones did, with a piece of paper that raises more questions than it answers, and an envelope that has never fully told anyone what it was. 50 years on, the letter sits exactly where it has always sat, neither authenticated nor disproven. Different examinations, conducted decades apart, have not produced a single accepted conclusion. It remains the only written communication anyone connected to this case has ever received, presented as coming from one of the 3 girls, and no confirmed sighting, verified contact, or corroborated trace of any of them has ever followed it, in all the decades since. Did the letter explain what happened? Or was it written to make sure no one kept looking? The letter arrived within a day of the girls being reported missing, and by most accounts, the department's early lean toward a voluntary departure explanation was already taking shape around the same time. It isn't possible, from the public record, to say with certainty which came first, or whether the letter shaped that framing or simply arrived alongside it. What is documented is that the case was routed, in its first hours, to the Fort Worth Police Department's Youth Division, within its Missing Persons Bureau. Investigators appear to have approached the disappearance, at least initially, as a possible voluntary departure, rather than a case involving likely harm. Routing a case through that particular division does not, on its own, establish that the girls were formally classified as runaways, only that the case was handled, at least at first, by the unit responsible for that category of cases. Whether that early framing reflected genuine belief, procedural default, or something else, the public record doesn't say. What is less clear, decades later, is exactly what investigative steps were or weren't taken around the vehicle itself in those first days. Family members and later researchers have long argued that basic forensic work, the kind now considered routine, was neglected because of the runaway assumption. That criticism has been repeated often enough that it has become part of how the case is generally understood. But the public sources reviewed for this film do not establish the full extent of the early forensic processing, one way or another. What can be said with more confidence is that whatever was done, it did not produce a break in the case. By 1978, 4 years into the investigation, the case's lead investigator, George Hudson, gave an interview that has been quoted in coverage of the case ever since. According to that reporting, he told a reporter that the department had never even gotten the girls, quote, off the parking lot of the shopping center. It is a blunt statement, and one that has shaped public perception of the case's early years for nearly 50 years. With official progress limited, the girls' own families increasingly took on the work of investigating themselves. Beyond hiring their own investigator, the families distributed missing person flyers across the state and contacted newspapers around the country in an effort to keep the case in public view. It amounted to a sustained public awareness campaign run by grieving relatives well before that kind of family-led advocacy became a familiar feature of unsolved cases nationally. In 1975, the families hired a private investigator named John Swaim. Over the next several years, Swaim pursued a range of tips and leads on the family's behalf, including searches in multiple parts of the state, often working directly with volunteers recruited through the case's growing public profile. In 1979, Swaim died. His death has been described, in accounts of the case, as an apparent suicide. Those same accounts state that his files were destroyed after his death, reportedly at his own instruction. What, if anything, those files contained has never been established, and this film could not independently verify the circumstances of their destruction beyond what has already been reported elsewhere. The search that followed Swaim's involvement didn't so much end as scatter across the state. In April 1975, acting on a tip that the girls' bodies had been left under a bridge, Swaim led more than 100 volunteers to Port Lavaca, on the Texas Gulf Coast, roughly 300 miles from Fort Worth. Nothing was found. A year later, in 1976, an oil drilling crew working in Brazoria County, closer to Houston than to Fort Worth, uncovered 3 skeletons in a field. For a period, it seemed possible the search might be over. Investigators compared the remains against dental records and X-rays. They were found to belong to a teenage boy, roughly 15 to 17 years old, and 2 other individuals. None of them were Rachel, Renee, or Julie. That same year, a self-described dowser writing from Hawaii claimed the girls' bodies had been left near a gas well outside Rising Star in Eastland County, more than 100 miles west of Fort Worth. Dozens of lawmen and volunteers searched the area for hours and found nothing. It was one of several unconventional leads the families pursued during these years, including consultations with psychics, the kind of search that tends to emerge when a case goes unresolved long enough that few possibilities feel safe to leave unchecked. Each of these searches represented real effort, followed by nothing. None of them moved the case meaningfully closer to an answer, as the case itself remained unresolved. The letter, meanwhile, has continued to factor into the family's account of the investigation. Terry Moseley, Julie's brother, has said in more recent interviews that the family has not always been able to review the letter themselves, and that, as far as the family understands, it remains among the department's files. This film could not independently confirm its current custody beyond that family account. Much of what happened inside the investigation during this period simply isn't part of the public record. The publicly available record does not provide a complete account of every investigative step taken or not taken in these years, an absence that left the families, by their own accounts, often uncertain what, if anything, was being done on their behalf. Somewhere in that gap sits one witness account in particular. According to the man who gave it, he first reported what he saw to police within days of the girl's disappearance in 1974. That account would not become part of the public conversation around this case for more than 25 years. What the surviving record confirms about that original 1974 report, whether it was logged, followed up, or simply lost to time, is not something this film can establish. This film will return to his account in full later. The family's own search didn't end with Swaim. By the mid-1990s, Rachel's brother, Rusty Arnold, had connected with another private investigator, and the two continued pursuing leads together in the years that followed. Arnold has remained a visible presence in the case ever since, including through a website and a public social media group dedicated to keeping the girls' disappearance in view. For more than 2 decades, that was the shape of the case. A letter no one could fully explain, a car no one could account for, and searches that kept turning up someone else's tragedy instead of an answer to this one. Then, in January of 2001, the Fort Worth Police Department reassigned the file to a homicide detective working within its cold case unit. Old witness statements were pulled back out. New interviews were conducted, more than 20 of them, with people who hadn't been asked anything in years. After more than 2 decades of dead ends, old claims and old witnesses were receiving renewed attention. Something, at least procedurally, had changed. Those interviews, conducted through the early months of 2001, turned up family members, former witnesses, and acquaintances of the 3 girls, many of whom had not been formally questioned since the 1970s. For a case that had gone years at a time without any visible movement, it was, at minimum, a sign that someone inside the department had decided the file was worth reopening in earnest. Some reporting from that period states that investigators had narrowed their attention to a small number of individuals, described in at least one account as 5 persons of interest. This film could not independently confirm that specific number through a second source, so it is offered here with that caveat, not as settled fact. What can be said with more confidence is that the review produced renewed interest in people who had already been part of the case's history for decades, rather than entirely new names. The detective assigned to the case, Tom Bocher, gave interviews at the time that have been quoted since. According to that reporting, he said investigators believed the girls had, at some point, been with someone they trusted, and that more than one person was likely involved in whatever happened afterward. Those are his stated beliefs, attributed to him directly. This film treats them as exactly that, a working theory offered by the detective assigned to the case, not a proven conclusion, and not an accusation against any specific person. Within the family itself, suspicion had, at times, settled closer to home than investigators ever stated publicly. In the earliest days of the case, Tommy Trlica, as Rachel's husband and the letter's recipient, drew a degree of scrutiny simply by virtue of his position. That scrutiny appears to have been brief, and no public record indicates it produced formal charges or a sustained investigation focused on him specifically. As explored earlier in this film, a separate, contested claim about the letter's authorship has continued to attach his name to the case's central piece of evidence, a claim this film has already been careful to distinguish from any claim of involvement in what happened to the girls. Authorship of a letter, even if it were someday resolved beyond doubt, is not the same question as responsibility for a disappearance, and this film will not treat it as one. Suspicion has also at times extended to Rachel's older sister, Deborah. Deborah had lived in the same household as Rachel and Tommy, and had, before Rachel's marriage, been engaged to Tommy herself. Some family members, most notably Rachel's brother, Rusty, have suggested over the years that they believe Deborah knows more than she has said publicly. Deborah has consistently and publicly denied this. In a January 2000 interview, she told a reporter she did not write the letter, did not know who did, and did not know what happened to her sister, adding that she had nothing to hide. No public record indicates she was ever named a suspect by police, refused to cooperate with investigators, or was linked to the case by any physical evidence. This film presents the family's suspicion as exactly that, an unresolved rift within a grieving family, sustained by proximity and circumstance rather than evidence, not as an accusation of its own. Investigators also had to weigh the same uncorroborated pickup truck account introduced earlier in this film, a claim that had never been traced to an identified witness. A separate account, offered by a man in Houston in 1981, 7 years after the girls disappeared, described 3 men forcing 3 girls into a van at the mall, one of whom reportedly claimed the oldest girl as his own. Investigators attempted to use hypnosis to help the witness recall a license plate. It didn't work. No van, and no men matching that description, were ever identified. By 2001, it too had sat unresolved for 2 decades. Of all the accounts connected to the case, though, one in particular resurfaced publicly around this time and drew the most renewed attention. A claim from a man named Bill Hutchins, a former Fort Worth police officer who had also worked security at the Sears store inside Seminary South. According to Hutchins, he personally saw the 3 girls on the night of December 23, 1974, not in the afternoon, but around 11:30 that night, riding in a pickup truck with a young Sears security guard he identified by name. He described the girls as relaxed, even laughing, giving no visible sign of distress. Hutchins has said he reported what he saw to police within days of the disappearance in 1974, but that his account wasn't seriously revisited until it resurfaced decades later, around 2001, when he brought it to a local news station himself. Investigators did follow up on the claim at that time. According to reporting on the case, they located and interviewed the security guard Hutchins named. He denied that the girls had ever been in his vehicle. There is a problem with the timeline that neither confirms nor fully dismisses the claim. By the family's own well-documented account, the girls' car had already been found locked and empty by early evening, and the search for them, including a father keeping watch from a nearby rooftop, was already underway by nightfall. If Hutchins's account is accurate, it would mean the girls were alive, unharmed, and apparently at ease in a truck nearly 6 hours after their own families had already begun searching for them in a panic. That isn't impossible, but it is difficult to reconcile, and this film has not been able to resolve it. It's presented here exactly as it stands, an account made by a named person that conflicts with another well-documented set of facts, with no explanation available for the gap between them. For a moment, in the early 2000s, the case had the shape of something that might resolve. A detective with a theory, a shortened list of names, a witness willing to go on camera after decades of silence, describing the girls as he said he'd seen them last, alive, at ease, riding away into the dark. It is, of all the moments in this case's 50-year history, probably the closest it ever came to feeling like an answer was within reach. Then the timeline didn't hold up, the guard said no, and the names on that short list stayed exactly what they had always been. People investigators found interesting, not people investigators could charge. None of what came out of the 2001 review, the re-interviews, the narrow detention, Busher's stated theory, Hutchins's claim, or the guard's denial, produced an arrest. No one was charged. No one was formally named by police in any public statement this film has been able to locate as a suspect. A short list may have existed. Old witnesses were re-examined. Names had surfaced, but none of it became an arrest. If investigators had questions, the families had something heavier, 50 years of waiting. If investigators had questions, the families had something heavier, 50 years of waiting. The renewed attention of 2001 did not fade all at once, but it did not resolve the case either. In the years that followed, both official and family efforts continued, in fits and starts, without ever producing the kind of answer that would let anyone close the file. There was no single moment when the case went cold again. It simply continued, year after year, in the space between an open file and an unanswered question. In 2018 and 2019, working with volunteer search organizations and using sonar equipment, the family located 3 vehicles submerged in Benbrook Lake, several miles from where the girls disappeared. The search was prompted by a tip connecting a car, reportedly disposed of around the same time as the disappearance, to the lake. 2 of the 3 vehicles were raised, in separate operations. Neither was connected to the case. Accounts differ on what became of the third, and this film could not resolve that discrepancy from the public record. What the search did confirm, if nothing else, is the family's willingness, more than 40 years on, to fund and organize a full underwater recovery effort themselves, on the strength of a single tip. Around the same period, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children produced updated images of what Rachel, Renee, and Julie might look like today, using age progression technology, most recently in 2020. The faces in those images are age-progressed approximations, built from family features and the passage of time rather than any confirmed sighting. They exist for one simple reason. No verified image of any of the three girls has surfaced since December of 1974. In 2023, on National Missing Children's Day, those age-progressed images went up on billboards across North Texas in a partnership between the family, Clear Channel, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and the Texas Center for the Missing. Drivers passing through North Texas that year would have seen three age-progressed approximations of women now in their 60s, built from photographs of the teenagers and the child they were the last time anyone who loved them saw them clearly. It was, in its own way, still the same request the families had been making since 1974. Has anyone seen them? December of 2024 marked 50 years since the three girls disappeared. The anniversary drew renewed press coverage and renewed appeals from the family, largely carried by Julie's brother, Terry Moseley, who has continued speaking publicly about the case well into his own 60s, decades after the promise ring he gave Renee on the last morning anyone in his family ever saw her. In interviews given around the anniversary, he and other relatives have continued to say plainly what the family has said since December of 1974, that they don't believe the girls left on their own, and that they have never stopped wanting an answer. Not every parent who waited at that shopping center in December of 1974 is still here to see whatever answer might eventually come. Rachel's father, Cotton Arnold, died of cancer roughly 6 months after his daughter disappeared, without ever learning her fate. As of the most recent reporting available to this production, Rachel's mother, Fran Langston, remains living. Julie's mother, Rayanne, spent years afterward in and out of psychiatric care, by the family's own account, still without an answer.